Hallahan, step away from the table. Keep your hands where I can see them.
Part of me has been hoping you would.
The offering, Marcus, the cash you've been taking for 6 years.
Marcus Halloran operated without oversight for 9 years as the treasurer of Grace Covenant Fellowship. Every Sunday, 400 people trusted him with their generosity. Not one person ever checked.
It was me, all of it. I stopped being able to
More than
carry
$1
it.
million from this congregation.
Do what you have to. I am not going to run. I think I have been waiting to set it down for...
He would not get to finish that sentence. The officers standing in Marcus Halloran's kitchen that Wednesday morning already had the notebook, not the deposit log, not the falsified board reports. The other one, the weather-stained spiral notebook that had been sitting inside a coffee can on the top shelf of his garage workbench for 6 years. Inside it, in pencil, in his own careful handwriting, were the true Sunday collection totals of Grace Covenant Fellowship, listed in a neat column beside the smaller numbers he had reported to the church board. 312 Sundays, roughly $1.2 million, and the man who had stolen it knew every single figure to the dollar because he wrote it down twice. Before we go any further, I have to ask you something. Would you have caught this one? A soft-spoken retiree who arrives early every Sunday to count the collection, who stays late to lock the side door, who has handled the church's books for 9 years without a single member ever complaining. Would you have asked to see the actual bank statement? Drop your honest answer in the comments below. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. This channel doesn't let stories like this get buried, and this one only gets worse from here. Marcus Ellis Halloran was born in Cedar Glen in the summer of 1967. His father, Wendell Halloran, worked second shift at the Cedar Glen paperboard mill for 29 years. He was a soft-spoken machinist who ate the same packed sandwich every night and kept a running tally of every household expense in a Buster Brown shoebox on top of the refrigerator. His mother, Ruth, taught piano out of the front parlor, $4 a lesson, 45 minutes at a time, and she recorded every payment in a green cloth-bound ledger book with a red spine. That shoebox and that green ledger were Marcus Halloran's first exposure to bookkeeping. By the time he was 10 years old, he was the one his mother handed the lesson envelopes to on Saturday mornings so he could count them and mark them off in her book. He was not a remarkable student. Cedar Glen Central High School, class of 1985, ranked 17th out of a graduating class of 89. Teachers in his yearbook wrote things like, quiet, dependable, will be missed by his desk mates, and one of the tidiest bookkeepers I have ever seen in a sophomore accounting class. A guidance counselor's note in his file read simply, focused, methodical, lacks initiative, but never misses a deadline. That last phrase would follow him for the rest of his career. He enrolled at Wabash Valley Community College the following fall and finished a 2-year associate's in small business accounting in the spring of 1987. His first job was as a junior clerk at Hensley & Boone, a 2-partner accounting firm above the drugstore on Cedar Glen's Main Street. His starting wage was $6.25 an hour. He arrived early. He stayed late. 10 months later, he was doing the small business books for half the shops on that same block. In 1991, he married Linda Cruz, a dental hygienist from the neighboring town of Millard. They bought a 2-bedroom bungalow on Sycamore Street for $49,000 and paid it off in 14 years. Their son, Bradley, was born in the spring of 1993. Marcus coached his Little League team from ages 7 through 12, kept meticulous scorebooks that other coaches asked to borrow, and once drove 42 miles in a snowstorm to return a lost mitt to a boy on the other team. In 1998, he opened his own practice out of the spare bedroom of the bungalow. Halloran Bookkeeping Services, small business tax returns, quarterly payroll filings, monthly reconciliations for local plumbers, hair salons, a 2-truck landscaping company, and the pediatric dental office where Linda worked. His clients loved him. His fees were low. He never once missed a filing deadline in 23 years of practice. The Cedar Glen Chamber of Commerce named him Volunteer of the Year in 2004 for helping 3 widowed women untangle the tax messes their late husbands had left behind. He joined Grace Covenant Fellowship in 2001 after the church's founding pastor, Reverend Daniel Whitfield, invited him to a men's breakfast at the Cedar Glen family diner. He liked the smallness of it. 400 members, 1 paid pastor, 1 paid worship leader, and everything else run by volunteers. He was ordained a deacon in 2008 and elected to the finance committee in 2011. He was the man other men in the congregation called when their mother's estate was tangled or their teenage daughter needed to file her first tax return. He never charged the church a cent. When the previous treasurer, Robert Dennehy, announced in the summer of 2015 that he and his wife were moving to a retirement community in Sun City, Arizona, to be closer to their grandchildren, no one else raised a hand. Marcus took the nomination unopposed. The vote was unanimous. The pastor prayed over him at the front of the sanctuary and asked the congregation to lay hands on his shoulders. 14 people did. That was August 30th, 2015. From that Sunday forward, Marcus Halloran had sole signatory authority over the general fund of Grace Covenant Fellowship, and no one at all was going to check his math. Grace Covenant Fellowship had been founded in 1988 in a rented Cedar Glen elementary school gymnasium and had grown, slowly and without drama, into a 400-member congregation meeting in a modest brick building on the corner of Elm and Pritchard. 2 Sunday services, a 9 o'clock contemporary, a 10:45 traditional, a midweek Bible study on Wednesdays, a youth group on Sunday evenings, a benevolence fund that quietly paid past due utility bills for members who had lost their jobs, a missions fund that sent short-term teams to eastern Kentucky and to a partner church in rural Guatemala, and a building fund that had been slowly saving toward a new roof and a rebuilt HVAC system for almost a decade. The cash offering was counted immediately after each service in a small back office behind the sanctuary, next to the pastor's study. The bylaws of Grace Covenant, adopted in 1988 and amended twice, contained what was known as the 2-counter rule. Every Sunday's collection was to be counted by 2 designated laypeople in the same room, with the totals initialed by both before the money went into the vinyl deposit bag. The rule had been followed for the first 25 years of the church's existence. In the spring of 2013, the rule quietly stopped being followed. A stomach flu had taken out both of the regular Sunday counters on the same weekend, and the treasurer at the time, Robert Dennehy, had counted the collection alone in order to make the Monday morning deposit. The next Sunday, one of the counters was still sick, then a scheduling conflict, then a family vacation. Within 2 months, the 2-counter rule had been effectively abandoned, and no board member ever moved to formally restore it. It was the kind of small procedural death that happens in small institutions all the time. Nobody was watching for it, because nobody thought it needed watching. By the time Marcus Halloran took the treasurer's chair in the fall of 2015, the counting room was almost always a room with 1 person in it. The pastor did not enter it. The board did not enter it. The Sunday school teachers ended their classes on the far side of the building. The custodian, an older gentleman named Alvin Krause, who had been with the church since it rented the elementary school gym, considered the counting room off-limits out of respect. The treasurer had sole signatory authority on the general fund checking account at First Midwestern Bank. Monthly financial reports were compiled by the treasurer, printed as PDF summaries, and distributed at the board meeting held on the 2nd Tuesday of each month. The reports listed income by category, expenses by category, and net change in each of the 3 restricted funds. No board member had ever asked for underlying bank statements, not once, in 9 years. The trust framework was not naive, it was relational. Grace Covenant was a congregation of people who had baptized each other's children, buried each other's parents, brought casseroles to each other's hospital rooms. If you had asked any board member in 2015 whether Marcus Halloran was capable of stealing from the collection plate, they would have laughed at you before they got angry with you. The most valuable safeguard the church had was not procedural. It was the character of the man they had elected. The first skim was on Sunday, October 25th, 2015, 2 months into his tenure. The actual count, both services combined, was $4,347 in cash and checks. Marcus recorded $4,140. The difference, $207, went into an envelope inside his briefcase. He drove home. He sat in the driveway in his 2011 Chevrolet Silverado for 11 minutes before going inside. He did not tell his wife. He did not spend the money that week. He put it in a red Folgers coffee can on the top shelf of his garage workbench and closed the lid. Nothing happened. No one called. No one asked. The deposit slip cleared First Midwestern on Tuesday morning at the recorded amount. The pastor thanked him for another faithful week of service on Wednesday at the men's Bible study. The following Sunday, Marcus counted the collection again, alone, in the same back office. This time, he skimmed $310, then $240, then $400. By Christmas Eve of that first year, on a night when the sanctuary was packed with visitors and the collection totaled $9,812, he recorded $8,900 and pocketed the difference, $912, in a single evening. The escalation was slow, patient, and organized. By the middle of 2017, Marcus was skimming between $300 and $500 from most Sunday collections, more on holidays, and a full $1,000 on Easter and Christmas. The cash accumulated in the coffee can. When the can filled, he transferred the contents to a fireproof lockbox bolted to the underside of his garage workbench. When the lockbox began to fill, he started depositing the excess into a personal savings account at a credit union in the next county over, in amounts small enough to avoid federal currency reporting. But the cash skim had a natural ceiling. Cash offerings at Grace Covenant averaged around $6,000 a week. If he took too much, the recorded deposit would look absurdly low, and someone might eventually notice. So, in the spring of 2018, he opened a second avenue. He registered a Delaware limited liability company called Cedar Ridge Facilities Maintenance. It had no address other than a mail forwarding service. It had no employees. It had no equipment. It had no website. It had a bank account at a regional bank 93 miles from Cedar Glen, opened with his own driver's license and social security number. Marcus was the sole member and the sole signatory. Then, as treasurer of Grace Covenant, he began writing checks to Cedar Ridge Facilities Maintenance out of the church's general fund. $2,400 for HVAC filter service, $3,800 for parking lot resurfacing consultation, $5,000 for roof inspection, $6,200 for asbestos survey. The checks were round dollar amounts and always under the $10,000 threshold that would have required board pre-approval. He entered them into the church's accounting software under building maintenance. He kept the paper copies of invoices, which he had generated himself on his home laptop, in a manila folder in his home office. No board member ever asked to see them. When Grace Covenant added online giving in 2020 through a platform called TitheStream, Marcus set up the church's account and made himself the administrator. Then he opened a second account with the credit union in the next county, styling it Grace Covenant Fellowship Facilities Fund, using the church's employer identification number, but listing himself as the authorized signer. He rerouted a percentage of every electronic tithe into that account. Between the cash skim, the fake vendor checks, and the rerouted digital giving, Marcus Halloran was taking, on average, $3,800 a week from Grace Covenant Fellowship by the summer of 2022. And then there was the notebook, the weather-stained spiral notebook with the pale blue cover. He had bought it at the Cedar Glen Ace Hardware on a Saturday in early October of 2015, a week before the first skim. In it, week by week, in soft pencil, he recorded the actual Sunday collection totals in one column and the reported totals in another. He did not need to keep it. It was the only piece of paper in the entire scheme that could destroy him. But he was a bookkeeper. He had been a bookkeeper since he was 10 years old, counting his mother's $4 piano envelopes at the kitchen table. He could not sit down every Sunday with a stack of cash in his hands and not write down what was really there. The board election of March 2024 was, by every account, the most boring in Grace Covenant's history. 2 open seats, 3 candidates, a brief round of applause when the results were announced. But one of the two new board members would end Marcus Halloran's 9 years as treasurer within 7 weeks of being seated. His name was Harold Krieger. He was 73 years old, a retired state auditor who had spent 31 years in the office of the Cedar Glen County Comptroller before hanging it up in 2019 and joining Grace Covenant with his wife Marlene after her stroke. He was quiet in meetings. He wore a plain gray suit and a plain black tie. He had never asked a single question in the Finance Committee updates that had been distributed in his church membership packet. We're about to get into how this fell apart. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel is different. We don't skip the details, we don't smooth over the ugly parts, and we don't let cases like this get buried under stories that get more clicks. Hit subscribe if you want to see how the system actually handled this one. The verdict, when it comes, is going to surprise you. At his first board meeting on April 8, 2024, Harold Krieger sat quietly through the pastor's ministry update, the missions committee report, and the youth pastor's summer camp budget. When Marcus Halloran distributed the monthly financials PDF, Harold thumbed through the 4 printed pages without saying anything. He asked one question at the end of the meeting. "Marcus," he said, "I wonder if you could bring the actual bank statements to the next meeting. Not the summary, just the statements from the bank." Marcus said, "Of course, no problem," and made a note in his phone. When he got home that night, he sat at his kitchen table for an hour and a half without moving. For the next 3 weeks, he stalled. He told Harold the bank's online portal was locked out after too many login attempts. He told Harold the branch had been slow returning his call. He told Harold that with tax season winding down at his private practice, he had been backed up and would have the statements at the May meeting for sure. Harold, who had listened to variations of that same sentence in county audit interviews for 3 decades, drove to the First Midwestern branch on Elm Street the following Monday morning and requested certified copies of the last 24 months of statements as a board member of Grace Covenant Fellowship. The branch manager knew him. The statements were on his kitchen table by Wednesday afternoon. He sat with them until 2 in the morning. What he saw was not one problem, but a shape. A pattern of round dollar checks to a vendor he had never heard of. Withdrawals that didn't match anything in the summary reports. Monthly deposit totals that fluctuated more than any healthy congregation's giving actually does. By 4 in the morning, he had made a list of 19 specific questions. By 10 the next morning, he was on the phone with the pastor. By that Friday, the board had voted, unanimously and without Marcus in the room, to hire an outside forensic accountant. Nobody used the word fraud yet. They used the word irregularities. They did not tell Marcus what was happening. The forensic accountant was Susan Reyes, a certified fraud examiner from a 2-person firm in the state capital. She spent 4 days on the ground at Grace Covenant, working out of a spare Sunday school classroom that the pastor had cleared for her, and another 6 weeks at her office, reconstructing 6 years of the church's finances from bank records, canceled checks, and tithe stream logs. What she found was not a mystery. What she found was arithmetic. The parallel account at the credit union in the next county, styled Grace Covenant Fellowship Facilities Fund, had received $187,000 in rerouted electronic tithes over 4 years. The account's only authorized signer was Marcus Halloran. No board member had ever authorized its creation, and no minutes of any board meeting mentioned it. Cedar Ridge Facilities Maintenance, the Delaware LLC that had received $562,000 in checks from Grace Covenant over 6 years, had no business filing in any state where it could plausibly have performed the work described on its invoices. Its Delaware registration listed a mail forwarding service as its address. It had no employees on any payroll system. It had never filed a corporate tax return. It had never registered as a vendor in the church's official vendor list, which required board approval. It had, according to a supplemental letter Susan Reyes attached to her report, no discernible existence beyond a checking account and a filing fee. And the cash. Susan Reyes could not directly measure what had been skimmed from the offering plate. What she could measure was the gap between what the pastor and ushers had recalled as visually normal collections and what had actually been deposited. Over 6 years, using tithe stream data as a control and comparing to peer congregations of similar size, she estimated the cash shortfall at approximately $640,000. Total, roughly $1.2 million. Detective Roy Panetta of the Cedar Glen Police Department opened a case file on May 17, 2024, after Susan Reyes and the pastor sat down with him at the station and walked him through her report. A search warrant for Marcus Halloran's home was signed by a magistrate on May 21st and executed at 7:42 in the morning on May 22nd. Marcus was still in his bathrobe when Detective Panetta and 2 uniformed officers knocked on the door. They found the manila folders of fake invoices in his home office. They found the fireproof lockbox in the garage. They found $41,300 in cash inside it, banded and labeled by year. And on the top shelf of his workbench, inside a rusted red Folgers coffee can, they found the weather-stained spiral notebook with the pale blue cover. Detective Panetta opened it in the garage. He turned the pages one at a time. He was a Cedar Glen native. He had grown up 2 blocks from Grace Covenant Fellowship. His grandmother's funeral had been held in that sanctuary in 1998. He read every entry. $912, Christmas Eve 2015. $1,411, Easter Sunday 2017. $384, an ordinary Sunday in July of 2019. The true amount in one column, the reported amount in the other. 6 years of the tidiest fraud he had ever seen. They walked back into the kitchen. Linda Halloran was standing at the counter in her housecoat, holding a mug of coffee she had never lifted to her mouth. Marcus was seated at the kitchen table with his hands flat on the placemat, exactly the way he sat every morning to read the newspaper. Detective Panetta placed the notebook on the table between them, closed. "Mr. Halloran," Detective Panetta said, "do you know what this is?" Marcus looked at the notebook for a long time. He did not touch it. "Yes," he said, "I know what it is. Would you like to tell me?" "It's my count," Marcus said. "It's the real count." Linda Halloran set her coffee mug down on the counter. It made a small sound. "Marcus," she said. He did not look at her. Detective Panetta read him his rights from a laminated card he kept in his breast pocket. Marcus nodded at the right places. When Detective Panetta asked whether he understood, Marcus said yes, very quietly. When Detective Panetta asked whether he wanted to speak with an attorney, Marcus said he did. "I have one more question before we stop," Detective Panetta said. "You didn't have to keep this notebook. Why did you keep it?" Marcus Halloran looked up at him for the first time. His eyes were dry. His hands, on the placemat, had not moved. "Because it was the real number," he said. "Somebody had to write it down." He did not speak again in that kitchen. He stood up when Detective Panetta asked him to. He allowed the officers to put him in handcuffs at the front door. He did not turn around to look at his wife. He was placed in the back of a Cedar Glen Police Department cruiser at 8:16 in the morning. On the drive to the station, according to the arrest report, he asked one question. He asked whether he would be able to make his 10 o'clock tax appointment. Marcus Halloran was charged in state court on May 24, 2024, with theft over $100,000, money laundering, and forgery of financial records. The lead charge carried a maximum sentence of 20 years. He was released on a $50,000 bond that his sister in Millard put up against her house. His defense attorney, a Cedar Glen lawyer named Peter Ainsworth, who had known Marcus since the two of them coached Little League together in 2001, entered no plea at the arraignment. The plea came 4 months later, on September 18, 2024, after a series of quiet negotiations between Ainsworth and the assistant district attorney, Margaret Willowick. Marcus pleaded guilty to the lead theft count and to 1 count of money laundering. In exchange, the state agreed to dismiss the remaining counts at sentencing. Prosecutors sought full restitution of $1.2 million, along with a state prison sentence in the range of 6 to 9 years. Sentencing was set for the following February. At the plea hearing, Judge Herman Voss asked Marcus to describe, in his own words, what he had done. Marcus stood at the defense table in a dark gray suit that Linda had picked out for him, and, in a voice so quiet that the court reporter had to ask him to repeat 2 of the sentences, he read a statement his attorney had helped him prepare. He had counted the collection. He had recorded lower figures than the actual totals. He had kept the difference. He had written checks to a vendor he had created for the purpose of removing money from the church. He had opened a second account in the church's name and rerouted electronic tithes into it. He had done these things every week for 6 years. He was sorry for the harm he had caused to his church family. He asked their forgiveness. 6 members of Grace Covenant Fellowship spoke at the sentencing hearing, held on February 11th, 2025. 2 spoke in support of leniency. 4 did not. The victim impact statement that ran the longest in the transcript was delivered by a woman named Doreen Whitcomb, a 68-year-old widow who had been a member of Grace Covenant since 1993. She spoke without notes. For 6 years, she said, I put $10 in the plate every Sunday. I know that isn't much to some people, but it was 2 hours of my work at the Cedar Glen Library, and I gave it because I believed it was going to feed people and fix the roof and send our kids to camp. I put a hand-addressed envelope in that plate every week. He knew my name was on it. He counted it. He knew exactly what I gave, and he wrote it down twice. Judge Voss addressed Marcus Halloran for 6 minutes before pronouncing sentence. You did not steal from a corporation, the judge said. You did not steal from an insurance company or a government fund. You stole from 400 people who handed you their money by hand, in envelopes with their names on them, and who trusted you precisely because you showed up early and stayed late. Every Sunday for 6 years, you sat alone in a room with the generosity of your neighbors, and you separated it into 2 piles. One pile you gave back to them. The other you kept for yourself. And you wrote down both piles because you are a bookkeeper, and you could not stop yourself from knowing the truth. That is not a lapse. That is not a moment of weakness. That is a discipline of dishonesty maintained across 312 Sundays. Judge Voss sentenced Marcus Halloran to 7 years in state prison at the Rushmore Correctional Facility, a medium-security institution in the western part of the state, with 3 additional years of supervised release. Restitution was set at $1.2 million to be paid to Grace Covenant Fellowship through the state's Crime Victim Compensation Fund upon his release. Grace Covenant Fellowship voted, at a members' meeting in March of 2025, to keep Marcus Halloran on the church's membership rolls, but to permanently bar him from any leadership role or any position with fiduciary responsibility. Attendance dropped 22% over the following 12 months. The youth summer camp was canceled for 2 consecutive years, while the building fund was quietly backfilled from the missions budget. The 2-counter rule was restored, in writing, at the next board meeting after his arrest. 3 separate members counted the collection the following Sunday. They initialed the total in 3 different colors of ink. The weather-stained spiral notebook with the pale blue cover was entered into evidence as Exhibit 1. It sits, at the time of this recording, in a sealed manila envelope in the state's evidence archive. That case was hard to hear, but the case on the right side of your screen right now is on another level entirely.